MWMO. I am the superintendent of the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, a 72-mile-long unit of the national park system that runs entirely through the Mississippi River in the Twin Cities. Outside of this building is one of the world's greatest rivers, and this building falls within a unit of the national park system, an agency that Wallace Stegner, one of America's great writers, called America's best idea. 100 years ago, Woodrow Wilson signed a bill establishing the National Park Service. Its authorizing purpose was to protect America's greatest places and resources, and to provide the enjoyment thereof. The Mississippi National River and Recreation Area is the only national park unit whose mission is the Mississippi River. So we have a very special interest in the river's water quality. That is why we partnered again with Friends of the Mississippi River, one of the nation's leading river protection organizations, to produce a second State of the River report. A clean, healthy Mississippi River is critical to the quality of life in the Twin Cities, the region, and the nation. More than 1 million people in the Twin Cities drink water from the Mississippi taken from the river just above us. The river as a recreational asset is quickly growing. We just introduced this idea of a paddle share program, a kayak bike share program, and one of those stations will sit outside the Watershed Management Organization next year. And we put over 15,000 kids on the Mississippi River every year. We prepared this report with the help of more than 30 scientific and technical advisors to provide a summary of the river's overall health and its water quality. We wanted to be able to measure how is the river doing, essentially take its temperature. Today we will provide an overview of the report and highlight a few of its key findings. We ask that you hold your questions until the end, and then we'll open the floor for those questions. And I think our panel of experts will stay around until after the meeting. We can talk to them individually. Now I want to introduce Whitney Clark, the Executive Director of Friends of the Mississippi River. FMR is the leading advocacy voice for the Mississippi River here in the Twin Cities. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Again, my name is Whitney Clark, W-H-I-T-N-E-Y-C-L-A-R-K. I'm the Executive Director of Friends of the Mississippi River. And for years, people, knowing what I do for a living, have asked me the question, how's the river doing? And despite it being what I do for a living, it's been a hard question to answer. The river is a complex living ecosystem, and many factors affect its health. And you can have some indicators pointing down and some pointing up, and it's very dynamic and they change. So one of the objectives of the State of the River report is to focus our public attention on the science of river health. You've heard the old saying that you can't manage what you don't measure, and what we're trying to do with this report is identify the positive trends, identify the things that are going well, and then try to figure out what are the things that we need to keep doing to keep those trends going in the right direction. Obviously, we find some very concerning trends as well, and when we do, our hope is that we will be able to use this data to work with policymakers to develop new policies to address these problems. The first edition of the State of the River Report, the 2012 edition, led to a number of very significant policy changes that are beginning to have an important impact on the Mississippi River and Minnesota's environment. Back in 2013, the state legislature passed a ban on coal tar sealants, which were a large source of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, into the river and many waters. The following year, as a direct result of the attention that this report generated around the issue, the Minnesota legislature became the first state in the nation to ban consumer products, cleaning products containing triclosan. And the FDA just this month has recently followed suit with a very national federal ruling. And then the following year, in 2015, we were successful, a large coalition of conservation organizations and river protection organizations, including Friends of the Mississippi River, were able to get Congress, believe it or not, to close the upper St. Anthony Falls lock to prevent the upstream spread of invasive Asian carp. So these reports can make a difference, and we're hoping that the 2016 report doesn't disappoint. So what's in it? State of the River Report 2016. As John said, we've worked with over 30 scientific advisors to select the key indicators that would best answer that question. How is the Mississippi River doing? We've tried to write and design a report that distills very complex data and into information that's easy to understand, that's clear and concise, and can be understood by non-scientists. The report what it does is it groups 14 key indicators of river health into categories that address the status of the river for swimming and recreation, the health of its fish and wildlife, the health of its overall ecosystem, and then additional contaminants that are emerging as a serious cause for concern. The report, as you're about to find out, documents that the river has improved in water quality and ecological health over time, but it's also facing some very distressing trends and challenges. So you can read all about it in the report, but today we're going to highlight 3 specific indicators that we think are very important to pull out. They're flow and hydrology, nitrate, and chloride. So to discuss the first of these 3, flow and hydrology, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sean Schottler, Senior Research Scientist for the St. Croix Watershed Research Station.
Thanks, Whitney. There's my contact information there. I'm Sean Schottler from the St. Croix Watershed Research Station, also part of the Science Museum of Minnesota. And as Whitney described the river, he described it as a living organism. And a living organism has a pulse. And flow in the river is the pulse of the watershed. And just like your pulse is symptomatic of what's going on in your body, the flow in the river is symptomatic of what's going on in the watershed. And your pulse may go up or down, it's not necessarily good or bad. And flow in the river goes up or down, it's not necessarily good or bad. But very often, what's changing the pulse, what's changing the flow of the river, is also changing the delivery of the pollutants. And the more that we understand what changes flow and why it goes up and down, allows us to make much better management decisions about how to manage and reduce delivery of pollutants. Flows have gone up, and it's linked to both land use and changes in precipitation. A quick primer. Flow is basically what's left over after you've had rainfall. That's our only source of water, precipitation. And most of that precipitation, generally more than 70%, evaporates back into the atmosphere. Flow in the river is a residual of that. And because transpiration, that's the loss of water either by just radiant heat or through plants, is the largest part of the hydrologic cycle, when we make small changes to evaporation, we make large changes to runoff. And the things that change evaporation are like pavement, it doesn't allow water to sit there and evaporate, changes in vegetation, and certainly in the agricultural world, changes in artificial drainage. Tiling all can change the flow basically through changing evaporation. It's the part you don't think about because evaporation is invisible. In the Mississippi River, the flows have gone up by about 25% over the last 70 years. If we look further down in the watershed towards the Minnesota, flows have gone up by close to 50% over that same time period. Those increases in flow are generally related to and part of the reason why things like sediment and nitrogen have also gone up. So why is flow changing? Well, one, we simply have more water. There's more rain now than in the past. However, if you look at watersheds like the St. Croix River versus the Minnesota River, this plot here shows the amount of flow that you get per unit rain. The rainfall has gone up in both of those watersheds, but one of them we get a lot more flow per unit rain now than we did in the past, and that's the Minnesota watershed. And that's due to land use changes. Both cropping changes and drainage have increased the amount of flow that we get per unit rain. And that change is evident here. I know what you're thinking here. Oh, look it, all of the black places went away from 1860 to present. Those black places on the map are the depressional areas, the wetlands, low areas in the field, and that changes evaporation. Those were places where water used to sit and have a chance to evaporate. We now route much of that water directly to the river in increasing flows. This figure of High Island Creek down Minnesota watershed is why the St. Croix River and the Minnesota rivers have responded differently to the changes in precipitation, and why flows gone up. So management strategies, as we want to manage for things like nitrogen and sediment, we often need to manage for flow, for hydrology. That essentially boils down to water residence time in the landscape. We need to hold it there longer by whatever practice that is, whether it's changing vegetation, putting wetlands in, having rain gardens. We need to hold the water there that both allows for evaporation and the removal of the pollutants. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Pam Anderson from Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, who's going to talk about nitrate.
Hello, thank you. So I'm going to just give a highlight on the nitrate component of the report. And I want to talk about how it's impacting the Mississippi River, and then the associated threats and impacts to the river, the people who live by it, and the aquatic community that's in it. This is a picture of the Gulf of Mexico. This is what's known as the hypoxic zone, or the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And the reason that we have this up here is Minnesota contributes to that, and what we contribute is excess nitrate. When these algae blooms occur and die off, then it robs the Gulf of Mexico of oxygen, and we have a die-off of the marine life. So this is a much larger piece of the puzzle that Minnesota is playing a role in. So kind of closer to home, our contribution of nitrate to the rivers has increased substantially. So as I mentioned, that dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, our concentrations have actually increased significantly since 1976 through data collected in 2014. So the volume has gone up considerably. And on a positive note, we do have drinking water standards, and we're meeting them in the Mississippi River. That isn't the same for everywhere across the state and different water bodies. But we don't have a way to measure whether we're protecting our aquatic life based on our nitrogen concentrations. So that's what I'm going to try to cover here in the next few minutes. So, one thing that's important to notice, nitrate is naturally occurring as a common form of nitrogen. It's necessary for plant growth. So this is something that we want to have. The problem comes when we have too much of it. It quickly enters water bodies. As Sean mentioned, we've changed our flow regime, and as we have more flow, it can pick up more of that nitrate that we're adding to the landscape and carry it downstream. So some of the risks associated with that. The drinking water standard is 10 parts per million. So if you have levels above that, it becomes a risk. It's called blue baby syndrome, where your blood cannot get the oxygen that it needs. Aquatic life, nitrogen can play a role in disrupting the growth of aquatic organisms, and then the dead zone that we mentioned in the Gulf of Mexico. So where is this coming from? Well, in Minnesota, the biggest contributor is our agricultural regions. It's cropland drainage. It's the groundwater associated with that, and overland runoff. So that agricultural component is the largest contributor. Other things to note is we do have a point source contribution. So think our wastewater treatment plants here in the urban area. We have urban runoff, and every time we're flushing our toilets or water's going down the drain, that's a contribution that we're also contributing. There's also an atmospheric component to this. Nitrogen is something that comes out of the tailpipes of our cars. That goes up into the atmosphere, and it does come down as rain. So it's not just agriculture, but that is the biggest player. And then, as Sean mentioned, the flow is also playing into this. So as we're seeing those larger flow events, especially through our more agricultural regions, it is grabbing more of that nitrogen. So this is kind of a shot of the Mississippi River that we focused on for the report. I just want to call your attention up here. This is where the drinking water intake is. Just upstream of this area that John spoke to at the beginning of the presentation. Over 1 million people getting their drinking water from this source. So we are meeting the standard. If you look over here, our concentrations are below, 3.5 parts per million. So we're well below that 10 number that I called out. What you will notice here on the map are these different spots where data is collected. We have upstream of our drinking water, upstream of the Minnesota River confluence, and then the data coming in from downstream of the Minnesota River. And you'll notice that there's a considerable increase in concentration. So that's kind of recognizing that pulse that's coming in from our more agriculturally dominated regions. This is just kind of taking a snapshot over time. So this is showing how our concentrations have changed over time. And we have seen a considerable increase, as I mentioned earlier, from 1976 to 2014. We've had overall higher flows. And then, our agricultural systems have changed quite a bit in that time period as well. Much more intensified. We have changed our drainage considerably, fertilizer management. So there's a lot of pieces playing into it, and we've certainly increased our populations in the urban areas as well. So solutions, what can we do about it? So the state of Minnesota has a nutrient reduction strategy in place, and that kind of outlines steps that we can take to improve our, or to work towards reductions of both nitrogen and phosphorus across the state. We have a goal of reducing our nitrate concentrations by 45% by 2040. So that's going to take a lot of work. As we discussed earlier, our major sources include a lot of the agricultural components. So fertilizer, what kind of crops we have on the ground, that drainage, the piece that's feeding into flow. And then we have other sources. So we have our wastewater treatment facilities, we have the tailpipe emissions. So it's going to take a lot of work from a lot of different groups to make some progress. So at this point, I would like to introduce Brooke Asleson. She is also with the Pollution Control Agency, and she's going to speak to us about fluoride.
Thank you, Kim. I'm Brooke Asleson with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about fluoride, one of the indicators that is highlighted in the Sustainability Report. Fluoride, similar to nitrate, is also a naturally occurring element, but at high concentrations, it is toxic to aquatic life. In addition to being toxic to aquatic life, it has negative impacts on our groundwater, drinking water supplies. As many of you have probably seen our vehicles, our infrastructure, it's also very corrosive. And if you damage vegetation, it has negative impacts on our pets and wildlife as well. Fluoride is a permanent pollutant, and so unlike some of our other pollutants, it's not going to break down or degrade over time. It's going to continue to build up in our waters. And it is not feasible to remove this pollutant. There's not traditional practices that we can use to remove it. And so pollution prevention is very important for fluoride. Currently, the Mississippi River is meeting these standards for fluoride, but the levels are continuing to increase over time. It only takes 1 teaspoon of salt to permanently pollute 5 gallons of water. And we have monitored several water bodies across the metro area and found that 39 of those water bodies are above that standard, and another 38 are very near that standard. The primary source of this fluoride is from our winter de-icing salts and water softeners. As you can see here in this figure, this is a breakdown of the sources of salt in the metro area. The majority of it is coming from de-icing salts. And we put about 350,000 tons of de-icing salt on our roads, parking lots, and sidewalks every winter in the Twin Cities metro area. Some research has also indicated that about 78% of that salt that's being put down on our hard surfaces is being retained in our local surface waters and groundwaters throughout the metro area. The good news is that the Mississippi River is currently well below our fluoride standard. However, there are many local tributaries that are above or are very near that standard of 1 teaspoon and 5 gallons of water. Monitoring data is also suggesting that our groundwater is increasing over time. We are seeing several shallow and some of our deep aquifers as well having higher concentrations of fluoride than we would expect. This is a figure showing you the concentrations of fluoride in the Mississippi River since 1985. So as you can see, it has dramatically increased over those years, about an 81% increase. And so this increase is not uncommon to see in other local surface water bodies as well as in our groundwater. While de-icers play a very important role in public safety, their use needs to be well managed to minimize the negative impacts and to reduce the maintenance costs. The state has recently adopted a fluoride management plan which identifies methods for winter maintenance professionals, for the public, for policymakers, for a wide array of audiences of things they can do to reduce chloride use without impacting public safety. Some of these solutions include enhanced monitoring. We need to continue to track the health of our water bodies and to show progress that we're making over time. In addition, for the winter maintenance industry, there's several practices that are highlighted, including improved storage of salt. It's important to cover that salt and protect it from rain and runoff. We also have a smart salting training program that is offered to both public and private salt applicators to learn the practices to help minimize their salt use without compromising public safety. There are some very innovative precision applications and technologies that are now available to some of our winter maintenance professionals to be very deliberate and smart about how and when they use salt and which type of product they use. This training and these practices can also be a useful tool to help minimize the fear of slip and fall lawsuits and to protect themselves in those situations. And then we also lay out some strategies for residents. It's important to minimize the amount of salt that residents are using in their homes and to be sure that the salt they're using is effective at the temperature. For example, rock salt is not effective at melting ice when it gets below 15 degrees. So it's important that the residents are using the salt product that's right for the time and the temperatures. Now I am going to turn it over to the authors of this report, Lark Weller and Trevor Russell.
Thank you again to Whitney and to John for kicking us off today, and to Sean and Pam and Brooke for highlighting 3 of the indicators in the report. What Lark and I are going to do now is highlight the overall status and trends of the 14 key indicators of the report, instead of answer the question, so how is the Mississippi River?
Right, and the good news is that the river is once again home to healthy bald eagle, mussel, and fish populations. As pollution has been cleaned up and habitat restored, we've seen that our wildlife locally has really rebounded. These are symbols not only of our shared ability to rejuvenate the Mississippi River, but our ability to do so in the future as well.
While the river does meet standards for chloride and pesticides, there are some concerns about the long-term impacts of these pollutants, and we feel like vigilance is required to minimize the long-term threat to the river over time.
The report also uncovers the fact that we have several indicators that give us cause for concern. The river is impaired by excess sediment, bacteria, and phosphorus, which degrade aquatic habitat and recreation. Fish consumption guidelines are in place throughout the river due to elevated levels of contaminants like PFOS and mercury. And we remain optimistic that these can be solved, but it's going to take much more work in order to do so.
Other indicators in the report are cause for alarm. As Sean mentioned, river flows have multiplied to worrisome levels, destabilizing the river system and flushing more pollutants downstream. Nitrate concentrations, as Pam mentioned, have increased by 44%. Invasive Asian carp continue to move into the Twin Cities metro area with potentially devastating consequences on aquatic life and recreation. The solutions to these problems are going to require new tools and determined public action if we're going to resolve them.
And finally, we looked at a number of additional contaminants and discovered that microplastic fibers, pharmaceuticals, and triclosan-derived dioxins in the Metro River pose uncertain risks to aquatic life and health. We need additional research into these contaminants and collective action in order to mitigate their potential long-term impacts.
So what the state of the river is telling us is that while the challenges we face are complex and daunting, the river is healthier today because of the actions of future generations. The return of aquatic wildlife to a once nearly dead river is evidence that restoring the river is possible through shared commitments and decisive public action. We remain hopeful that strong leadership and vocal support from river lovers across the state will help us pass a cleaner, healthier, and more vibrant Mississippi River on to future generations.
The report includes a couple of companion documents as well, and to learn more about what you can do in your home, yard, or community to help protect the river, you can consult the State of the River Report Stewardship Guide. And this year, we also worked with an educator to prepare a teacher's guide, and parents and educators can help pass the lessons of this report on to the next generation of river stewards through this teacher's guide.
Friends of the Mississippi River also created a separate policy guide. So this is a companion document that, from our perspective, highlights the top 10 things that federal, state, and local leaders can do to help resolve some of the issues that were raised in the report.
We hope that you'll take time to look over the report in detail, and it's written, we hope, in straightforward language with many graphics and maps to help bring the information visually. So we welcome you to check that out.
And all of this information and more is available at stateoftheriver.com. You can download the report's companion guides, you can contact us, and you can find out about future upcoming public events where you can learn even more about the state of the river. So with that, that is the state of the river. Thank you for coming. I'll ask Whitney to maybe come up and help us chaperone any questions and answers, and if you can, give your name and affiliation if you have a question that'll help us move this forward. Thank you, Whitney.
Great, thank you, everybody. A lot of information, but a lot of information. Are there questions about any of these things? And I'm probably not the person to answer most of them, so we've got our science team here as well. Yes?
My name is Susan Ju with City Pages. What sort of main policy changes are you targeting based on what you found in this report?
Policy changes. You want to tackle that one?
It's a great question. So our policy guide sort of highlights the top 10 things that state and local leaders can do, along with some federal policy. Probably the number one thing for us is a transition to more perennial cropping systems. As Sean and Pam both mentioned, agricultural land use and drainage practices can have an influence on both flow, sediment, nitrate, and other pollutants to the river. While the cropping systems we have now provide great economic benefits, and they're good in many ways, we have too many annual crops on the landscape. And when those crops are not yet in the spring, or they're harvested early and they're gone in the fall, we don't have the plant material to provide that evapotranspiration that stabilizes our hydrology and mitigates sediment and nitrate flushing from agricultural landscapes. It's all well and good to say we need more perennial crops in the landscape, but unless those things are profitable for producers, that's not going to happen. We don't have the tools to compel that kind of widespread landscape change. So what we look at in the report is specifically through the University of Minnesota's Forever Green Initiative, a new initiative being led by the Board of Water and Soil Resources called the Working Lands Watershed Restoration Program, and through potentially looking at biofuels tools to basically make those perennial crops and even some cover crops that can be planted in between growing seasons economically viable for producers. If we get those things in place, we have an economic incentive to put more perennial crops in the landscape, and that's going to get us to prosperous farms and clean water. Other things in the policy guide we look at are some of the chloride management strategies that Brooke talked about, continued research on bald eagles and fish, where we have some data, but we need more over time, and the resources may not be there to provide for that. Improvements in Asian carp control and drainage water management reform. We do mention that the state still lacks a nitrate standard for water quality. The EPA has been asking us to get that done for quite some time, and we know the agency is moving that forward, but we'd like to see that happen within the next 5 years. And additional research into things like microplastics, fertilizer management, and pharmaceutical management, where we maybe lack the right tools to adequately address those pollutant sources over time.
Am I reading this correctly, John Croman from Care 11, am I reading this correctly that there's no permitting for drain tile installation?
For most just field agriculture, today you could put a drain tile in without needing a state or federal permit. There are conditions where you would, wetlands, other things like that, but for the most part, agricultural field producers can install drain tiles that best fit their system. What we're asking for is some sort of permitting, notification, design components to that, so that local water managers know when those tile systems are going in and can work with producers to help optimize those to hold water back and help hold nutrients back on the field. We know that when you put drain tile in, your field may be more profitable. It is going to flush water more quickly, you're going to have a more consistent crop, but that does have consequences downstream. So we just want to sort of balance that agricultural productivity and profitability with managing the water quality implications downstream. So that sort of permitting or notification piece helps water managers and crop producers have that interface that'll help us to solve some of those problems.
I'm also curious about the lingering effects of the triclosan, even though it's banned, how long does it stay in the environment? I remember years ago that you was doing research about it being converted to dioxins by sunlight or river activity or whatever.
I'll take that one again. I didn't intend on answering all the questions, but these first two come up. Towards the back of the report in the additional contaminants of concern section, we do highlight the role that triclosan plays in triclosan-derived dioxins. And the short answer is we wash our hands with the same antibacterial soap that contains triclosan. About 95% of that is going down the drain through the wastewater treatment system, which isn't specifically designed to remove that contaminant. While in the wastewater treatment process, triclosan will encounter chlorine, which we use as a disinfectant, and that forms a new compound, a chlorinated triclosan derivative. Once that gets out into the river, it will come in contact with sunlight and photodegrade into a family of triclosan-derived dioxins. Those dioxins have built up in the river since the early 1960s. Levels of triclosan dioxins have increased 200 to 300%, measured in sediment at Lake Pepin. It's a natural lake on the Mississippi River, just downstream of the Twin Cities. During that same time, levels of all other dioxins have fallen by 73 to 90%. We don't yet have great information on the toxicity of these dioxins compared to other forms of dioxins or how long they're going to persist in our environment, but we do know that they pose potentially serious consequences for aquatic life and can work their way up the food chain. So that was the impetus for both our state phase out of triclosan and then the FDA basically phased it out because it doesn't actually provide much benefit in terms of getting your hands any cleaner. So if it's not providing much of a public benefit and it does have a public health and an environmental health risk over time, it's better to just move on to other products.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Zoe from the Journal, Southwest Journal. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the education guide. I'm sorry I'm not seeing it in my packet right now, but I know that MWMO has done a lot of work with Minneapolis Public Schools and bringing students into here for learning. Yeah,
Yes,
can you
Mark,
talk about
you want to take that?
general things?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and we do have copies available if you would like to follow up with that. So, when we released the 2012 State of the River report, we sort of uncovered the fact that a number of educators were using it in the classrooms and using it as a way to sort of prompt some lessons with their students. So, having that piece of information in mind, this time we worked with an educator, Dr. Meg Cavalier, who's the executive director of the Riverside Academy in St. Paul. So we worked with her to link the content of the State of the River report itself to Minnesota State education standards. So the guide goes through and provides curriculum, lessons, and service projects for grades 3 through 12 linked to the report itself. So we're really eager to see now, we have that informal piece of information that was used last time for educational purposes, but we're really eager to see now that we've developed it and very clearly linked it to state standards, which we know is something that educators are very interested in. So we're looking forward to seeing how it's used. But do follow up with us if you'd like to see a copy as well.
Can I?
Oh, it's on your thumb drive.
Oh, super. Can we talk a little bit about the importance of the schools and getting this information to kids?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, as we've said, one of the main purposes of the report itself is that we know people care about the Mississippi River, and there's a world of scientific research and data available around Mississippi River, but those two worlds don't always meet. So the purpose of the report itself is to link those worlds, to communicate the health of the river as we know it through research and science, and to communicate that in ways that are easier to understand for an average member of the public. So that's sort of our one approach, and that the report itself is aimed at a more adult audience, but certainly, as we know, Park Service is celebrating its 100th anniversary, but we know that we need to also be working with the future stewards of Mississippi River and of all natural resources. So I think to really target, to draw on people's innate appreciation of resources like the Mississippi River and to link that to information available on the health of the river was something that we wanted to be able to offer people.
Other questions?
Yeah, Elizabeth with
PR. I'm wondering, a lot of the efforts to curb nitrate and things from farmers' operations have been voluntary, and there's been questions about that. Do any of the steps in the policy guide that you're putting out today put a little more teeth into any of these things? Or is it more just about incentives and things like that that are voluntary?
Good question. Let me start with that, and then I'll ask Trevor to clean up what I missed. The scale of change that we need, especially on nitrogen, is huge. We need almost a 50% reduction to eliminate the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So we've been nibbling around the edges with voluntary measures in the past, and that's clearly, and this report shows, it's not getting us there. We're really not moving the needle. So we need new policies that have the potential to make big changes on the landscape. So some of what we're recommending in the report would be more on the regulatory side. I'm thinking specifically about new state regulation about requiring permits for drainage, new tile installation. Permits for new tile, you could also theoretically incentivize or require conservation drainage technology to be in place when farmers drain additional land. But we think, as Trevor said, we think the really big gains are likely to come from working with agriculture to develop, as Trevor said, new perennial crops, cash crops that farmers are happy to integrate into their corn and soybean rotation. We don't need to stop growing corn and soybeans. We just need to grow less of them. And we need to make that viable for farmers to do that. What did I miss?
I have a quick question. The pie chart on nitrate sources shows cropland drainage, cropland groundwater, cropland runoff. How do you distinguish, what are the differences between those three?
We're gonna do this for a second. Do you want to?
You go ahead if you have the pie chart.
Okay. I suppose I could probably just take us back to the pie chart. Sorry, this will be a little sloppy here. So the question is really, how do we distinguish between sources of nitrate to surface waters? Cropland drainage is what we consider nitrate from cropland drainage. What we're talking about is nitrate that moves down through the soil profile and into artificial drainage conveyances, so drain tiles, drainage ditches, things like that. And this is important for us to understand that those are the leading sources of nitrate to the Mississippi River. Some cropland groundwater nitrate will infiltrate slowly through the ground into shallow groundwater, and that groundwater will come back up into surface waters as part of a natural hydrologic dynamic. There's relatively little overland flow of nitrate off a farm field directly, mostly because we've intentionally routed the water elsewhere. So what this tells us is that between drainage, artificial drainage systems, and cropland groundwater, those are the primary sources of pollution in the Mississippi River. While we look at, can we do better to control nitrate in drainage systems, that's the biggest piece of the pie. And we've routed this pollutant through a very narrow pipe that is a single entry point into the nearby surface water. If we can find a way to put control systems, and we have technology that can remove that nitrate from that drainage water before it gets into the surface water, this is the lowest hanging fruit. And if we're going to clean up our drinking water supply, clean up our drinking water sources, and get to a really healthy and vibrant Mississippi River, we have to figure out a way to get a handle on nitrate in drainage systems.
But it's still important for me to bag my grass and say.
Yeah, I think when we look at the Mississippi River sort of holistically, urban land uses are about 6.9% of the total Mississippi River watershed. Urban runoff is 1% of the nitrate, about 7% of the phosphorus, about 6% of the sediment. So it's easy to look at a report like this and say what we do in our own backyard isn't important. But keep in mind that your local water resources are important. Your local lake or your local stream, the Rice Creek, the Minnehaha Creek, Como, Powderhorn. And that's where we have power in the metro areas, is to make land use changes and clean up our own backyard so that we do our part. When we talk about the stewardship guide, raking up grass clippings, leaves, excess fertilizer, picking up after your pet, picking up trash, those are the actions that you'll notice right away in your local water body. And so while globally we have a lot of agricultural related pollution to the Mississippi River, each of us can do our own part for Minnesota's water resources.
One thing I might add to that, it's the climate is helping us today. It's raining right now. As you leave today, take note of the wonderful rain gardens that have been installed here by the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization. See how they're working. And this is something. This is a big project, but we can all do our part by installing smaller rain gardens in our own properties. There was a question at the back of the room.
Yeah, looking at the part of the report about fish consumption, I noticed that there are charts talking about two reaches of the Metro River, from like Coon Rapids to St. Anthony, and then from Fornam to Hastings. So that it doesn't include the part that actually runs through the Twin Cities, including Whitman and Hot Creek, where I often see people fishing. Is this to say that you really shouldn't use any fish that are taken out of the river in that stretch?
Good question. Mark?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So one of the things that we discovered is the interesting situation around data with fish in the Mississippi River. So a lot of management agencies are looking at game fish in the Mississippi. So what we found for the fish consumption piece that you're asking specifically about is that there is data throughout the river, but it's not consistent in terms of the availability and the depth of that research for those stretches. So we provided the information for the stretches for which we had the best, most solid, statistically significant data. So there is information out there for other reaches, but we presented what we felt most, robustly provided information.
Would you eat fish taken out on the Mississippi River that's running right through the campus?
Yeah, I'm a vegetarian. So personally, I probably wouldn't, but yes, I think our point is, following those fish consumption advisories, is the Department of Health does a very careful job to make sure that those advisories are providing information so that the public health of public who might be eating fish from the river is protected. So if I were a vegetarian, yes. Yes.
I'm Sylvia Thomas with KVR Media, and I'm wondering specifically about the cropland drainage and the filter system. And I'm wondering how much that might cost, and if you think that that's actually a viable change that can be implemented in the next few years.
Let's invite Sean Schatzer after that.
Well, first of all, you get an A+, because you asked the question that we often don't ask, which is how much does it cost? We have, the MPCA has put, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has put together a nutrient management strategy, and they cobble together all the best management practices and the optimum configurations to reduce nitrogen to just 30%. And the estimate is $1.5 billion per year to get that reduction. And that includes the practices that you're talking about. And so when Whitney was talking about the fact that they're thinking about perennial crops and so on, it's because it's the scale. In that same nutrient management strategy, they show that even if we do the very best that we possibly can for having farmers apply nitrogen in the best way, we get what, an 8% reduction? It's not that big. So we have to find practices that reduce the pollutants and are profitable. And also, I would say, benefit other things like habitat. And those boil down to finding profitable perennial crops. And we have some, it's just a matter of changing the market. Things like alfalfa is a perennial crop, and we know how to grow it. We just need more of that on the landscape.
Sorry, can you just repeat that? It's $1.5 billion a year to get a reduction of.
I think it's 30%. I think that's the number. If you can, MPC, do you know that, right?
I don't know the number off the top of my head. I can get you the information.
The source is the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's nitrogen report, which came out, I think, 3 summers ago. And we can provide that for you.
So I can give you sort of a back and then a little calculation that helps you with scale. So when we put things on the landscape, we're generally, all of them, putting them in places where we're replacing some of the farmer's property. We have to compensate them for that. And that's generally for rental prices, somewhere around $200 an acre, between $100 and $300 an acre. And we need, oftentimes we need somewhere between 4 and 20% of the land to go into these practices. We have 15 million acres of row crop land. Take 10% of that, multiply by 200, and you end up with numbers that have a lot of zeros behind them. It's expensive.
Easements, renting easements is
Same,
better, is
same.
better than, or is more doable than buying, actually buying.
I don't know. I mean, it would depend on the practices, but either way, they're expensive. We have to find things where it's profitable for them to do it on their own.
I have a question about microplastics. So what kinds of plastics are in the river and what's new about that situation?
And I'm gonna turn over to Mark to answer that question.
Yeah, thank you. This is one of our new indicators this time around, and what we found was the public might have been hearing a lot about microbeads, which are a form of microplastic that is included in some cosmetic products, facial rubs, things like that. Those have been the subject of some legislative action, including here in Minnesota and then nationally in recent years. What we discovered was that there's a series of forms of microplastics. There are fibers, foams, pellets, beads. What we found in research from the park, both in the water itself, also in sediment and fish and muscle tissue, is that it's microplastic fibers that are actually the dominant form of microplastics here in the Mississippi River. And that does seem to correlate with findings elsewhere in the country. But what we're finding is that it's about 90% of the microplastics that we find in the river here are microplastic fibers. And we also discovered that their concentrations increase downstream of the metro wastewater treatment plants. So we see these are products that we link to synthetic clothing like micro fleece, polyester, nylon. So we believe that they're entering systems through being washed off clothing in laundry systems. Our wastewater treatment plants are not designed to specifically remove them. So we see their numbers going up downstream of wastewater treatment plants. So that was one of the new findings from the report.
Are those in disposable diapers too, so-called quote-unquote disposable diapers, are those?
Yes.
Is that where microplastic fibers come from?
I believe that is also the source. Can you follow up on that a little bit and talk a little bit about why we're concerned about that, about microfibers?
Yeah, so we're concerned for a family of reasons. So this is sort of one of those families of additional emerging contaminants of concern that we know a little bit about, but we know we need to learn quite a bit more about. But initial studies provide evidence that we have concerns for the presence of microplastics in the environment because they can have physical impacts on wildlife, either through making it through an animal's, like a mussel's digestive tract, or through just being consumed and then the wildlife thinks that they're full and kind of stops eating actual nutrition. They're linked to chemical impacts on wildlife, both from chemicals that are a part of the plastic product originally, but also they bind to additional pollutants in the river. So animals can take that up and that becomes a cumulative, persistent chemical situation for wildlife. And then we have some studies that link it to human health concerns as well, through digestive tract irritability. And also the smallest of these microplastics can make their way through through placental tissue. So those are things that we are starting to learn about, and those sort of trigger some concern that we know we need to learn. It suggests that we need to learn quite a bit more about that. In terms of the human impacts, we're finding traces of these microplastics in food sources like fish, honey, table salt, beer. So these are things that, we're concerned are in our environment, they're in our food sources, and we need to know quite a bit more about what their long-term impacts on both humans and wildlife might be.
Margo from the Northeastern newspaper, can you comment on the various industries along the river and what they spew out? There's been a lot of talk in terms of air pollution and breathing problems and so on, but are you seeing it in the water and also all these fireworks that we shoot off over the river? It's pretty, but I always worry about them falling into the river and what happens after that.
Yes, Interesting question. We're aware of those issues. Unfortunately, the report does not address that. One of the things that we have been pretty careful about doing in the State of the River report is to only include indicators for which we have significant, statistically valid data, and I don't think we know enough about those issues. And we didn't look at air quality at all. There is data on air quality, as you know, and significant public attention.
Then it comes down to the.
Right. Yeah, and we know that there is, that some of the pollutants that we're finding in the river, like mercury, for instance, do come from atmospheric deposition. I don't know if we know the percentage, if there's a number on that, but is it?
Well, for mercury, we're seeing there have been decreases over time, but those are recently going back up. So that's one of those cases where we have been making some progress, and we now have additional cause for concern. With mercury specifically, most of our sources come from outside of Minnesota, so we can do our work here, but we need to recognize that we're one member of a much larger community who are helping to drive that issue.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. And we'll stick around if there are additional questions. Thank you for coming today.